The rain slammed against the windows in relentless sheets, its cadence unbroken as if it sought entry into the house. Droplets streaked down the glass in uneven races, illuminated by the occasional flicker of dimming lights. I watched from the living room, feeling the emptiness of the house close in around me. My parents had rushed off hours earlier, murmuring something about a work emergency. They promised to return soon, but as the hours dragged on, I couldn't help but feel the hollow ache of their absence. The storm, the black sky, the endless sound of the rain. It all felt oppressive. I tried losing myself in the TV, but the weak reception turned every channel into static-laced shadows. My unease grew with every flicker of the screen. Every creak of the old house felt louder. The shadows stretched too far, reaching into corners that seemed darker than usual. Then the knock came. Sharp, unexpected. I froze, the remote slipping from my hand. Knock, knock, knock. Louder now, more insistent. Who would be out in weather like this? I rose slowly, the air itself feeling heavier. Peeking through the curtains revealed a drenched figure on the porch. Her soaked hair clung to her face. Her clothes were plastered to her thin frame. I recognized her, my new neighbor. She'd moved in recently, just a few houses down. I'd seen her once or twice, exchanged a polite hello. But now, she looked completely unhinged. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Something felt off. Finally, I cracked the door open. "Are you alone?" she asked in a soft, trembling voice. Her eyes darted past me into the house. The question made my stomach turn. "What do you mean?" I stammered, my throat suddenly dry. Her lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, though her expression never reached her eyes. "You shouldn't stay here tonight," she murmured before turning and walking off into the storm. Her departure was as sudden as her arrival. I leaned out, calling after her, but she vanished into the rain. Just like that, she was gone. My heartbeat thundered in my ears as I locked the door, my fingers fumbling with the latch. What had just happened? The living room felt colder when I returned. I couldn't shake her words or the strange, empty look in her eyes. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe she'd just gotten caught in the rain and wanted to warn me about something. But why would she leave without explaining? And why did she disappear into the night so quickly? Time dragged on. The storm continued to howl, and every time I glanced at the door, I half expected another knock. When none came, I slowly began to relax. But just as I started to feel the tension ease, I heard something else. A faint creaking sound, soft and rhythmic, coming from above. Footsteps. I froze, every muscle locking in place. I was alone. No one else was supposed to be here. The sound grew louder, steady, deliberate. They moved from one side of the upstairs hallway to the other. My stomach churned, and my chest tightened as I fought to breathe. The stairs loomed just to my left, but every instinct screamed at me to stay put. Still, I had to know. Heart hammering, I crept toward the staircase. My gaze darted upward, but I couldn't see much beyond the dark landing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking. No response, just the sound of the footsteps, now heavier, now slower. Then they stopped. Silence. A silence so heavy I could feel it pressing down on my chest. My breathing grew ragged as I tightened my grip on the banister. Slowly, carefully, I began to climb. The old wood creaked under my weight, and every step felt like it took an eternity. I reached the landing, and there, just slightly ajar, was my parents' bedroom door. The dim hallway light cast a sliver of illumination into the room. I pushed the door open with trembling fingers. At first, I saw nothing. Then, near the far window, two figures turned to face me. I gasped, stumbling backward. The figures were dressed in dark clothes, their faces obscured by the shadows. They stood perfectly still, but the air seemed to buzz around them. My mind raced, screaming at me to run, to do something, anything, but I couldn't move. Then one of them stepped forward. My paralysis broke, and I turned, bolting for the stairs. I sprinted down the hallway, their heavy footsteps pounding behind me. I didn't look back. My sole focus was the front door. I reached it, my hands shaking so badly I struggled with the lock. It finally clicked, and I threw the door open. Rain slammed against my face as I stumbled onto the porch, nearly slipping on the wet wood. The cold air shocked me back to my senses. I kept running, my bare feet pounding on the rain-slick sidewalk. Only once I reached the street did I risk looking over my shoulder. No one followed. Tears mixed with the rain on my face as I fumbled for my phone. My fingers were so numb I could barely dial. The dispatcher's voice was calm, steady, asking me questions I could hardly answer. All I could manage was a frantic, "There's someone in my house." Minutes passed like hours before the police arrived. They found no one. The house was empty, just as I had left it earlier that night. But the officer who walked upstairs noticed something chilling. Drawers pulled open, items scattered, as if someone had been searching for something. What was it they wanted? Why had they come to my house? The questions stayed with me long after the police left. And that woman, what had she meant when she said I shouldn't stay here tonight? Did she know something? Was she part of it? Or was she just another victim of the storm, trying to warn me of something she couldn't explain? Even now, I can't help but wonder what might have happened if I'd stayed. What were those men searching for? Were they still out there, waiting? Sometimes, when I wake in the middle of the night, I think I can hear footsteps overhead. The faint sound of floorboards creaking, growing louder and louder. It was one of those gray afternoons that felt like the world was holding its breath. Thick clouds hung low, smothering the sun, and a cold wind cut through the cemetery's stillness. I walked the familiar gravel path to Eliza's grave, clutching my jacket against the chill. This was a routine I never missed, a quiet Sunday visit to my late wife's resting place where I could talk to her, feel her presence, and find a small measure of peace. But that day, something was different. As I rounded a row of headstones, I saw a man standing a few plots over. His posture was strange, rigid, almost unnatural, and though I couldn't make out his features, I could feel his eyes on me. It wasn't unusual to see others paying respects, but there was something off about him. He didn't seem to be visiting a grave. He was just standing there, staring in my direction. I tried to focus on Eliza's grave, clearing the leaves and talking to her as I always did, but the man's presence weighed on me. It was like a shadow you couldn't escape, no matter how much you tried to ignore it. Every so often, I glanced up. He hadn't moved. It felt as though he was waiting for something I couldn't understand. After a while, I decided it was time to leave. But when I stood up and turned around, he was closer. I hadn't heard him approach, not a single footstep on the gravel. My chest tightened as he stepped forward, his clothes tattered and dirty, his eyes wild with some emotion I couldn't quite place. Desperation? Anger? Fear? Got any money? His voice was rough, more of a demand than a question. The way he asked it, without pretense, without politeness, set me on edge. "I don't have any cash," I said, keeping my voice calm. It was the truth. I never carried much, especially not here. But my answer didn't seem to satisfy him. He moved closer, and I could feel the air grow heavier, the atmosphere around us changing. "Don't lie to me," he hissed. "Everyone's got something." His tone was darker now, and he stepped into my path. There was no mistaking his intent. My heart raced as I tried to reason with him, my voice faltering. "I really don't have anything for you. I'm sorry." He didn't believe me. I could see it in his clenched fists, the way his body tensed like a coiled spring. The cemetery that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a trap. I glanced around, hoping to see anyone else. But there was no one, just us and the gravestones. "I'm leaving," I said, though my voice trembled. I tried stepping to the side, but he matched my movements, blocking my way. He was younger, stronger, and increasingly desperate. I knew I couldn't overpower him. My breath quickened, and my mind raced for an escape. And then I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. It wasn't a decision. It was instinct. My legs moved before I even realized it, carrying me down the path toward my car. The wind whipped against my face, and the overcast sky seemed to darken further. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran, the gravel crunching beneath my feet the only sound as my heartbeat thundered in my ears. I reached the car, fumbling with the keys. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the door unlocked. When I finally managed to swing it open, I threw myself inside, locked the doors, and started the engine in one frantic motion. I looked up, expecting to see him charging after me, but the man was gone. I drove straight to the police station, my heart still racing and my thoughts a jumble of fear and confusion. I told the officers everything. The man's demand for money, his menacing approach, the way he blocked my path. They took my statement, nodding with polite concern, but I could see the skepticism in their eyes. Maybe they thought he was just a homeless man down on his luck. Maybe they didn't believe me at all. A few days later, they called me. They'd found him, but he wasn't alive. His body was discovered beneath a broken headstone, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle, his eyes wide open and staring into the void. They couldn't explain how he had died, and there was no sign of what or who had left him there. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. Now, I only visit Eliza's grave during the day, when the sun is high and the world feels safe. But even then, the cemetery doesn't feel the same. I can't help but glance over my shoulder, certain that someone, or something, is watching me from the shadows. And sometimes, late at night, I dream of wild eyes, of a rough voice demanding what I don't have. Those dreams leave me wondering if he ever really left, or if he's still out there, waiting. That's the thought that haunted me, a bitter regret clinging to the edges of my mind like the shadowed trees that surrounded us. Jake and I had planned this trip for months, lured by the promise of a weekend far from the suffocating noise of the city. The idea of camping deep in the untouched woods, with no one around but the rustling leaves and the occasional call of a bird, seemed like the perfect escape. We were wrong. The day had started like something out of a postcard. We reached the trailhead just as the sun was rising, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and damp soil, and the forest stretched out before us, a world waiting to be explored. With heavy backpacks and light spirits, we ventured down a narrow trail, the morning sun filtering through the dense canopy above, creating a patchwork of light and shadow on the ground. The deeper we went, the quieter the world became, the hum of civilization fading until all we could hear was the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional distant call of a bird. It was perfect, or so we thought. After hours of hiking, we stumbled upon a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. The moss-covered ground felt soft underfoot, and the space had a hidden, untouched quality, as if no one had ever set foot there. It felt like ours. We pitched the tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the forest in an eerie twilight. The fire crackled, its warmth a welcome comfort against the chill of the evening. We ate in companionable silence, the stars above us more brilliant than I'd ever seen. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to faint embers, and the forest was unervingly quiet. For a moment, I lay there, trying to figure out what had disturbed my sleep. Then I heard it, a soft crunch of leaves, just outside the tent. My heart began to race. Jake was snoring softly beside me, oblivious. I strained to listen, hoping it was just a deer or maybe a fox. But something felt off, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked out. The clearing was bathed in shadows, the dim light from the dying embers casting long, distorted shapes across the ground. My breath caught when I saw them, footprints. Fresh, unmistakable human footprints leading from the edge of the clearing toward our tent. They hadn't been there before we set up camp, and they were too large to belong to either of us. Panic bubbled up inside me. Who else could be out here, miles from the nearest town? I shook Jake awake, my voice barely a whisper. He groggily sat up, but when he saw the look on my face and the footprints outside, his expression turned grim. We sat there in tense silence, straining our ears for any sound, any sign that we weren't alone. That's when we heard it, a faint chanting, so distant at first it almost blended with the rustling leaves. Low, rhythmic, and unsettling, it seemed to seep into the very air around us. The words were indistinct, but the tones sent a chill down my spine. It was coming from the direction of the footprints, from the dark woods just beyond the clearing. The chanting grew louder, more distinct, and with it came an oppressive sense of dread. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of the clearing. My blood ran cold. He was tall and emaciated, his ragged clothes hanging off him like tattered rags. His hair was long and matted, obscuring most of his face, but his eyes, they were hollow, void of anything human. His lips moved in that same eerie chant, the words a guttural, rhythmic murmur that seemed to vibrate in the air. Jake grabbed a branch from the fire, the embers flaring to life as he swung it toward the figure. The man stopped, his chant faltering as he stared at us with those lifeless eyes. Then, without warning, he lunged, a guttural scream erupting from his throat. We scrambled backward, tripping over each other in our panic. Jake swung the burning branch wildly, and the man recoiled, his movements jerky and unnatural. For a moment, he hesitated, his hollow eyes flickering with something unreadable, before he turned and fled back into the darkness, disappearing as suddenly as he had appeared. We didn't wait to see if he'd return. Grabbing what we could carry, we bolted, leaving behind the tent and most of our supplies. The forest seemed to close in around us as we ran, branches clawing at our clothes and faces. The chanting echoed faintly behind us, growing fainter but no less haunting. By the time we reached the trailhead, the first rays of dawn were breaking through the trees, and we collapsed onto the ground, trembling and gasping for air. Later, we reported the incident to the authorities. Their reaction was chillingly nonchalant. They told us about a man who'd been living in those woods for years, performing strange rituals and targeting campers who wandered too far off the beaten path. Despite several reports, they'd never been able to catch him. The details didn't make us feel any safer. We never went back to those woods. Even now, years later, I can't shake the image of that man. The hollow eyes, the unsettling chant, the way he seemed to drain the very air of its warmth. What was he doing out there? What would have happened if we hadn't woken up? Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, watching, waiting for the next unwary campers to cross into his domain. If you were in their situation, would you stay and try to confront the man or flee immediately? What do you think drives someone to live like that, performing strange rituals and haunting others? Could there be something supernatural at play, or was he just a disturbed individual? Those were the words scrawled on a damp note left behind by the stranger I picked up on a stormy night. They still echo in my mind, taunting me with the memory of what happened, or what could have happened. It all began with a decision I regret making every single day. The storm was merciless as I drove home after a grueling late-night shift. The rain came down in relentless sheets, hammering against my windshield and drowning out the hum of my car engine. The wipers worked furiously, but they barely made a dent in the torrent of water. The headlights illuminated a stretch of lonely road, twisting and turning through the dark countryside, flanked by towering trees swaying violently under the weight of the storm. It was the kind of night that made you feel like the last person left in the world. I was exhausted, my body aching from hours on my feet. All I wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and collapse into bed. The thought of my warm, quiet apartment kept me focused as the storm raged on. Lightning periodically split the sky, offering fleeting glimpses of the drenched, desolate landscape before plunging it back into oppressive darkness. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a figure standing by the side of the road. A man. He was soaked to the bone, holding out his thumb in a desperate plea for a ride. His clothes clung to his frame, water streaming down his face. He looked like he'd been standing there for hours, a lone silhouette against the chaos of the storm. I hesitated. My foot hovered over the brake. Common sense screamed at me not to stop. Picking up a hitchhiker in the middle of the night, in the middle of nowhere, wasn't just unwise. It was dangerous. But the sight of him, shivering in the rain, tugged at something deep inside me. I imagined myself in his position, stranded and vulnerable, and the guilt became too much. Against my better judgment, I sighed and pulled over. The car tires crunched on the wet gravel as he approached, his face obscured by the shadows cast by the dim interior lights. I leaned over and unlocked the door, my hands trembling slightly. He climbed in without hesitation, dripping water onto the seat. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice low and rough. "No problem," I replied, forcing a weak smile. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road. There's a gas station. You can drop me off there," he said, his tone barely above a whisper. I nodded and pulled back onto the road, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He sat silently beside me, staring straight ahead. The air inside the car felt heavy, oppressive. There was something unsettling about him that I couldn't quite pinpoint. His clothes were unremarkable, plain, dark, and worn. But his pale face and dark, unreadable eyes made my skin prickle. Minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the rhythmic thud of the windshield wipers. I felt his gaze on me, even though he never turned his head. The sensation of being studied, of being weighed and measured, gnawed at my nerves. My heart began to race, though I couldn't explain why. Finally, the gas station came into view, its flickering neon sign cutting through the storm. Relief washed over me as I pulled into the lot. The place was run down and isolated, but I'd never been happier to see a gas station in my life. "This is it," the man said, breaking the silence. I nodded and stopped the car near the entrance. He opened the door and stepped out into the rain without another word. As he closed the door, I felt a weight lift off my chest. I was alone again. The feeling of dread that had settled over me began to dissipate, replaced by the comforting hum of solitude. I took a deep breath and shifted the car into gear, ready to leave, when I noticed something on the passenger seat. A small, crumpled piece of paper. I hadn't seen him leave anything behind, but there it was, damp and unmistakable. Curiosity got the better of me. I picked it up and unfolded it, my hands trembling as I read the hastily scrawled message. "Check the back seat." My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head toward the back seat, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the sound of the storm. The car was dark, illuminated only by the flickering neon sign outside. My eyes struggled to adjust, scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The back seat was empty. I let out a shaky breath, but the unease didn't leave me. My mind raced. Had he been playing some kind of sick joke? Or worse, had someone else been in the car with us without my knowing? I locked the doors, my fingers fumbling with the button. The note sat crumpled in my lap, its warning etched into my brain. The rain intensified, the storm raging as if it would never end. The flickering neon light cast eerie shadows across the lot. I glanced around, half expecting to see the man watching me from the darkness. But the lot was empty. I wanted to leave, to put as much distance between myself and that gas station as possible, but my hands refused to stop shaking. Something was wrong. Deep down, I knew the man hadn't left that note as a joke. There had been a purpose behind it, a warning. Finally, I forced myself to shift the car into drive and pulled away. The road stretched out before me, dark and empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the shadows of the back seat. Even as the gas station faded into the distance, the memory of that note lingered. Who was that man? Why had he warned me? And why did I feel like something, or someone, was still following me? What do you think the man meant by "check the backseat"? Was it a genuine warning, a twisted joke, or something far more sinister? Could there have been someone, or something, else in the car?